The number on the board was wrong, and Vortessen intended to make sure every cadet in the room understood exactly how wrong it was. He tapped the display with one long gray-blue finger, and the projected equations swelled to fill the wall behind him, hovering over 400 seated cadets like a verdict waiting to be read. Fuel reserve, insufficient by 11%. Thrust margin, negative. Mission outcome, according to the tidy coalition notation stacked in 3 clean columns. Catastrophic loss, a vessel. Cadet Okafor, Vortessen said, and his translator rendered the name with the flat, careful precision of a species that did not enjoy being wrong, and therefore rarely was. Explain to the class how you arrived at a fuel reserve of 104% when the correct answer, derived from the standard Halvenic transit equations, is 93. Every head in the amphitheater turned. Dax Okafor did not stand up right away. He was aware, in the particular way a person becomes aware of silence, that this was the moment his instructors had been waiting 3 months for, the moment they finally caught the human doing math like a human. He stood. "I used the right number, sir," he said. "I just didn't stop where the equation stops." Vortessen's crest, a thin membrane of skin that rose and fell along the ridge of his skull, lifted half an inch. Among the Halvenic, that was the equivalent of a raised eyebrow, and it was not a friendly gesture. "There is nowhere else to stop," Vortessen said. "The equation is complete. It has been complete for 11,000 years. It was complete before your species had discovered agriculture." The Halvenic transit equations were printed, by tradition, on actual paper for every exam, a ceremonial nod to the fact that the equations predated digital notation by several thousand years and were considered, in some circles, too dignified to be reduced entirely to a screen. Vortessen held Dax's paper now, 1 page thick like every other paper in the stack behind him, except that this one had a second sheet stapled behind it, slightly crooked, the staple driven in by hand rather than by the classroom's automated binder, which told anyone paying attention that Dax had added it after submission closed, using whatever was available in the supply closet, because it had mattered to him more that the second page exist than that it be properly filed. A ripple of quiet amusement went through the alien half of the room. Not cruelty, exactly, just the comfortable superiority of people who had never had to be wrong about something that mattered. The human cadets, 17 of them scattered through the tiers like the first handful of pepper in a bowl of rice, did not laugh. They had learned in 3 months not to. "I'd like to show my work," Dax said, "if that's allowed." "It is allowed," Vortessen said, in the tone of someone allowing a child to explain why the sky was orange. "It will not change the fact that your reserve calculation exceeds the theoretical maximum fuel capacity of the vessel in question. You have invented fuel that does not exist, cadet. That is not creative engineering. That is failure. With respect, sir, I didn't invent fuel. I invented margin. There is no variable in the Halvenic transit equations called margin." "No, sir," Dax said. "That's kind of my point." He walked down to the terminal at the base of the amphitheater, aware of 900 eyes and 1 furious crest, and pulled up his exam file. He did not rush. He had learned that much from 3 months of being the only human most of these cadets had ever spoken to. Rushing looked like guilt, and he wasn't guilty of anything except doing the problem a different way. He found the page. "Turn the page," he said, and sent it to the display. Dax Okafor had joined the Coalition Logistics Academy 9 months after Earth signed its provisional membership charter, part of the first cohort of humans ever permitted inside a Halvenic classroom. He had not been the top candidate. He had been, by every metric the selection committee used, somewhere in the comfortable middle, a former merchant marine engineer from Lagos, with a degree he'd finished part-time while working double shifts on a bulk carrier. Chosen less for brilliance than for a service record that included, among other things, keeping a 40-year-old engine running for 6 extra weeks in the middle of the Atlantic using a bent spoon, a roll of tape, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the manual's answer was the only answer. Nobody on the selection committee had known, when they picked him, that this exact temperament was about to become the single most disruptive quality any human had brought to the coalition since the charter was signed. He had known, within the first week of classes, that something was strange about the way his instructors taught mathematics. It wasn't that the equations were wrong. He could follow every step, and every step was rigorous, elegant, and correct. It was that nobody around him seemed to ask what happened after the last step. Human engineering, from the first Roman aqueduct to the last human-built rocket, had always carried a second, unspoken question behind every calculation. What if we're wrong about something we don't know we're wrong about? Dax had grown up assuming that question was simply part of doing the math. It took him 3 months of coalition schooling to understand that, for the species who had invented the math he was learning, it was not. To understand why that sentence made Vortessin go very still, you have to understand what the Halvenic transit equations were, and why no one in 11,000 years had ever turned the page. The equations were the mathematical backbone of the Interstellar Logistics Coalition, the loose alliance of 41 member species that ran cargo, colonists, and warships across 9,000 light-years of charted space. They had been derived by the Halvenic themselves, back when the Halvenic were the only spacefaring civilization anyone knew about, and they had been refined generation after generation by mathematicians whose entire culture prized elegance, the way some cultures prized courage or wealth. A Halvenic proof was not considered finished when it was correct. It was considered finished when it was beautiful, when every unnecessary term had been stripped away, when the solution arrived not through brute effort, but through the natural, inevitable unfolding of the problem's own internal logic. By that standard, the transit equations were a masterpiece. They calculated fuel burn, thrust curves, gravitational slingshots, and re-entry angles with a precision that had not needed updating in over a millennium. Every species that joined the coalition learned them. Every navigator, from the six-legged Ashari to the translucent, drifting once Sona, trained on the same equations, took the same exams, and flew, in the end, by the same numbers. The equations had one page. That was the elegance of it. One equation, one substitution, one clean answer, the way a Halvenic proof was supposed to work. There was no second page, because a second page would have meant the first page was incomplete, and the Halvenic did not tolerate incompleteness in their mathematics any more than they tolerated it in their architecture, their music, or their government. Dax's exam had 2 pages. The first page was the transit equation, filled out correctly, arriving, as Vortessin had said, at 93% fuel reserve. Exactly what 11,000 years of Halvenic mathematics predicted. The second page was titled, in Dax's blocky human handwriting, translated dutifully by the classroom terminal into the elegant looping script of Halvenic. What actually happens? Vortessin read the second page in silence for 11 seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you have watched someone read something that unravels 11,000 years of certainty in 11 seconds. And understand what that kind of silence costs a person who has never had to spend it before. The second page did not use the transit equations at all. It used something Dax had cobbled together from 3 different disciplines his instructors had never bothered to check whether humans studied: statistics, structural fatigue analysis, and, buried in a footnote that made Vortessin's crest twitch, actuarial science, the branch of human mathematics literally invented to calculate the odds that things would go wrong and put a price on it. Dax's second page didn't ask how much fuel the mission needed if everything went exactly as calculated. It asked how much fuel the mission needed if it didn't. It accounted for atmospheric density variance on the approach vector, a number the transit equations treated as a fixed constant, because in 11,000 years of travel between charted worlds, no Halvenic pilot had ever needed to fly through an atmosphere they hadn't already surveyed to 9 decimal places. It accounted for thruster degradation over the vessel's operational lifetime, because human engines, unlike Halvenic ones, were not rebuilt to factory tolerance every 6 months. Sometimes they were flown until they broke, because that was cheaper, and cheaper mattered when you were a species that had crossed an ocean in wooden boats before it had crossed a solar system. It accounted, in a section Dax had almost been embarrassed to include, for pilot error under fatigue, pulled from 3 centuries of aviation accident data that no alien species had ever needed to collect, because no alien species had ever flown anything with a design flaw, and a live crew, and no time to fix it before launch. 11%. That was the gap between the equation and the world. 11% of margin that the most elegant mathematics in the galaxy did not include, because the Helvetic had never needed it, because the Helvetic had never had to solve a problem with equipment that might fail, information that might be wrong, or a pilot who might be one bad night's sleep away from a mistake. This is not mathematics, Vortessen said finally. This is superstition dressed in decimal points. It's called a safety factor, sir, Dax said. Every human engineer uses one. We build bridges to hold 10 times the weight they'll ever carry. We don't do that because we don't trust the math on how much weight steel can hold. We do it because we don't trust the 10,000 things that happen to steel between the blueprint and the bridge. The transit equations are not a bridge, cadet. They are physics. With respect, sir, physics doesn't fly the ship. People do. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the tiers, one of the other human cadets, a broad-shouldered woman named Priya Anand, who had, in 3 months, developed a reputation for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right time, muttered something that the translator caught and rendered, apparently against its own better judgment, as, "Oh, he's really doing this." Afterward, in the mess hall that the human cadets had claimed, mostly by attrition, as their own corner of the station, Priya dropped her tray across from him hard enough to make the cutlery jump. "You do know," she said, "that you just told the man who grades your practicals that his entire species doesn't understand risk." "I told him his equations don't account for risk. There's a difference. He is his equations, Dax. That's the part you're missing. You didn't criticize his homework. You criticized the thing he spent 40 years being the best in the sector at." She stole a piece of bread off his tray without asking, which had become, in 3 months, its own kind of apology. "For what it's worth, I think you're right. I also think being right is going to get you exactly nothing until it gets you something enormous, and there's no comfortable space in between." "That's oddly specific. I read a lot of history," Priya said. "It's usually how it goes." She was not wrong, and Dax, walking back to his quarters that night past a row of viewports that showed nothing but the hard, clean starlight of a system no human had ever charted before the Coalition invited them in, found himself thinking less about the 0 on his record than about the 11% sitting, unaccounted for, in every ship the Academy would ever fly. It was the kind of thought that did not let a person sleep particularly well, and it did not. Vortessen's crest had not come back down. "Your score stands," he said. 0. You will retake the practical evaluation in the standard notation without your, a pause, the translator hunting for the correct degree of contempt, annotations. "Understood, sir," Dax said and sat back down, and did not argue, because he had already learned the second thing about being the only human in a room full of aliens who had 11,000 years of unbroken confidence. You did not win an argument in the room where you'd started it. You won it somewhere else, later, when the room could not pretend it hadn't been listening. The somewhere else, as it turned out, was Base 7 of the Coalition Logistics Depot orbiting Halvan Prime, for days later, and involved a cargo hauler, a training exercise, and a decision that nobody on the review board would have called brave at the time because it did not feel brave. It felt like doing homework. The exercise was simple, on paper. A live cargo run unmanned, from the depot to a resupply station 11 hours out, flying a corridor that had been surveyed and resurveyed by 3 generations of Helvetic navigators. It was a kind of run instructors assigned specifically because nothing went wrong on it, a controlled demonstration for a visiting delegation of Coalition logistics officers who wanted to see, with their own eyes, how efficiently the newest member species cadets could execute the transit equations under supervision. Dax was not supposed to be flying it. He was supposed to be watching it from the observation deck with the rest of his cohort, 3 days into his suspension from active simulation work, still smarting from a 0 that no amount of correct engineering could erase from his record. But the assigned pilot, a Helvetic cadet named Saradone, had a stomach virus that the base medical officer diagnosed with mild embarrassment 40 minutes before departure, and someone needed a qualified backup. And the only other cadet in the building rated on that class of hauler happened to be the human currently persona non grata in every math department on the station. Vortessen, who had drawn the short straw of overseeing the exercise, looked at the roster, looked at Dax, and said, with the air of a man selecting the lesser of 2 professional embarrassments, "You will fly the standard equation. 93% reserve. No annotations." "Understood, sir," Dax said and meant it. And this is the part of the story where a lesser account would have him quietly disobey and load the extra 11% anyway, and be vindicated, and everyone learns a lesson about trusting your instincts. That is not what happened. Dax loaded exactly 93% because he had been ordered to, because disobeying a direct order 4 days after being humiliated for insubordinate mathematics was not going to help his case, and because if he was honest with himself, which he tried to be, even when it was inconvenient, there was a small, stubborn part of him that wanted to be wrong about the 11%, wanted the elegant equation to be right, and his footnotes to be exactly the paranoid overcorrection Vortessen thought they were. It would have made the rest of his training a great deal easier. He was not wrong. The failure began, as failures in space usually do, as something too small to notice. 40 minutes into the transit, a micrometeorite no larger than a grain of sand struck the hauler's portside thermal radiator at a velocity that turned it, briefly, into something closer to a bullet than a pebble. The radiator's outer panel absorbed the impact and did exactly what it was designed to do, which was crack in a controlled, harmless way along a stress line engineered for precisely this scenario. The problem was the panel underneath it, which had been manufactured in a Helvetic shipyard 14 months earlier during a supply shortage that had forced a substitution of composite material. A substitution logged, approved, and forgotten, because the transit equations did not have a variable for manufacturing tolerance drift, because in 11,000 years, no Helvetic shipyard had ever needed one. The substitute composite handled heat almost as well as the original. Almost. Under the specific combination of impact stress and the accumulated microfractures of 14 months of ordinary thermal cycling, the panel underneath cracked too, in a way it had not been designed to. The hauler's cooling system began losing efficiency at a rate of about 0.5% per minute, which is the kind of number that sounds meaningless until you are the one flying the ship, and it starts to mean everything. Dax noticed it at minute 43, because he had built a habit, a very human habit, inherited from 3 centuries of pilots who had learned the hard way that instruments lie less than confidence does, of checking secondary systems every 5 minutes regardless of what the primary display told him. The primary display, running on Helvetic diagnostic software, did not flag the radiator fault as urgent, because the transit equations associated systems monitor had been calibrated to Helvetic manufacturing tolerances, and by those tolerances, the panel should not have been capable of failing this way at all. As far as the ship's brain was concerned, this simply wasn't happening. Dax flagged it anyway, radioed it in, and got, in return, a slightly irritated acknowledgement from mission control that suggested he was being cautious to the point of nuisance. He kept flying. He kept checking. At minute 61, the cooling efficiency had dropped to 82%, still within tolerance, still nothing to worry about according to every gauge that mattered to Helvetic engineering. By minute 90, it had dropped to 60%, and the hauler's main thruster, the one component on the entire vessel that ran hottest and needed the cooling system most, began drawing more fuel to compensate for the heat-related loss in combustion efficiency. This, too, was not something the transit equations accounted for, because Helvetic thrusters, built and rebuilt to factory tolerance every 6 months, essentially never ran hot enough for the effect to matter. It was a footnote in nobody's textbook. It was, however, precisely the kind of thing a species that had spent 300 years watching engines degrade under real-world stress had learned, slowly and expensively, to expect. At minute 110, with just under 5 hours left in the transit and the fuel gauge reading numbers that made the observation deck's monitoring officer sit up very straight in her chair, the ship's Helvetic-designed autopilot, following its Helvetic-derived math to the letter, calmly informed Dax that the mission remained on schedule and that fuel reserves were nominal. Dax did the arithmetic himself on a hand terminal, using the same footnoted, unelegant 11% heavier numbers that had gotten him a 0 4 days earlier, and got a very different answer. At the current rate of thermal loss and compensating fuel draw, the hauler would run dry 90 minutes short of the resupply station. Not catastrophically. There was no explosion in this version of the story, no dramatic countdown, just a long, cold, silent drift, 11 billion kilometers from anything, with a crew manifest to 0, because the run was unmanned, and a cargo hold full of medical supplies that a colony 3 jumps away was waiting on. which meant the only real cost if he did nothing would be time, resources, and quietly, invisibly, in the report nobody would read until much later, the confirmation, once again, that the transit equations were correct, because unmanned failures rarely got investigated with the kind of scrutiny that would have found the 14-month-old composite substitution 3 folders deep in a maintenance log. The ship would simply be listed as lost to undetermined mechanical failure. The same phrase that had closed out 11 similar incidents across the Coalition's records in the last 40 years, each one filed and forgotten because nobody had ever had a reason to ask what the mechanical failures had in common. Dax had a reason. He had spent 4 days memorizing the second page of his own exam. For about 90 seconds, alone in the cramped observation pod at the back of an unmanned cargo hauler's manual override station, 11 billion kilometers from anyone who could help him if he guessed wrong, Dax allowed himself to be afraid. It was not a dramatic fear. It did not announce itself with racing pulse or trembling hands. It arrived the way fear usually arrives for people who have spent their working lives around machinery that can kill you if you stop respecting it. As a cold, narrow clarity, a sudden and total absence of anything in his head except the problem in front of him and the shrinking window in which he was allowed to solve it. He thought briefly and uselessly about the 0 on his transcript and about Vortessen's crest lifting half an inch in the amphitheater, and about how neither of those things weighed anything at all compared to a cargo hold of medical supplies drifting cold and silent for the next few centuries, because nobody had thought to ask what happens if the equation is right and the world isn't. Then he stopped thinking about any of it, because fear that doesn't turn into action is just noise, and noise was the one thing he could not afford in the next 90 minutes. He did not panic, because panicking is not, contrary to popular belief, what humans are especially good at. What humans are especially good at is improvising a fix for a problem using whatever happens to be within arm's reach, a skill with a much longer and less glamorous evolutionary history than courage. What was within arm's reach 90 minutes into an unmanned cargo hauler's transit was a partial manual override on the thruster's fuel mixture, intended for emergency docking maneuvers and never, in the ship's operational history, used for anything else. A coolant reserve tank rated for the radiator system, but plumbed, by an accident of shared architecture, into a line that could, with some encouragement, feed the secondary thermal loop as well, and roughly 4 hours of margin, the exact 11% Vortessen had called invented fuel, sitting unused in the hold, because Dax had loaded the tanks exactly to specification and not one drop more. Except he hadn't loaded them exactly to specification. He had loaded them to specification, and then, in the last 10 minutes before departure, alone on the fueling deck, while everyone else was occupied with the visiting delegation, quietly and without telling anyone, topped off the reserve tank to the number his second page had calculated. Not the full 11%. He hadn't had the authority or the time to fight that battle twice in 1 week, but enough. A compromise for extra percent, loaded under the maintenance code for standard evaporative loss allowance, a category so boring that nobody had ever audited it, because nobody had ever needed to. It was not disobedience. It was, if anyone had asked, well within his discretion as the pilot of record to compensate for evaporative loss, and evaporative loss was, after all, a real and documented phenomenon, even if the specific number he'd used for it happened to correspond, with suspicious exactness, to the difference between 93 and 97. For percent was not 11. It would not solve the problem. It would buy him, by his own quick calculation, about 40 extra minutes. 40 minutes, it turned out, was exactly enough time to rig a manual coolant bypass by hand, cut the thruster's fuel draw by throttling the mixture to a ratio the ship's own systems flagged as inadvisable, and limp the hauler into the outer edge of the resupply station's sensor range at 11% power and 4 minutes of fuel to spare, moving so slowly that the station's automated docking system initially logged the approach as a debris field. The review board convened 6 days later in a chamber on Halvan Prime that had not, in living memory, needed to review the actions of a first-term human cadet, because first-term human cadets had not, until 3 months ago, existed in the Coalition's training pipeline at all. Vortessen sat on the board. This was, in the opinion of at least 2 of his colleagues, a mistake, Given that the incident under review directly and publicly contradicted a position he had taken in front of 400 witnesses less than 2 weeks earlier. But Hellvenic procedure did not recognize conflict of interest as a category distinct from professional accountability, and Vortessen had not asked to be recused. The board's senior officer, an old Hellvenic administrator named Ressa Vel, whose crest had gone the pale, weathered gray of someone who had adjudicated a great many arguments and enjoyed almost none of them, opened the proceedings by having the ship's flight recorder played in full, without commentary, for the entire room. It took 90 minutes to listen to a transit that had lasted 5.5 hours, because the recorder played only the moments flagged as significant, and there had turned out to be a great many of them once someone finally sat down and looked. The radiator strike at minute 40. Dax's first flag dismissed. The cooling curve dropping steadily against a backdrop of instrument readouts that insisted, with total and unwavering confidence, that everything remained nominal. The moment, at minute 118, when Dax's voice came through the recording, flat and unhurried, requesting authorization for a manual override that mission control, checking the same nominal instruments, initially denied. Authorization denied, said the recording of the mission control officer, a young Ashari technician who would later tell investigators, with visible distress, that she had simply been reading the numbers the equations gave her. Current telemetry shows all systems within acceptable parameters. Current telemetry is wrong, Dax's recorded voice said. I need the override. On what basis, Cadet? There was a pause on the recording, 3 seconds time-stamped, that the board would later discuss for longer than almost anything else in the hearing. Turn the page, Dax's voice said. He had, it emerged, transmitted his second exam page to Mission Control 11 minutes into the crisis, unprompted, on the theory that if he was about to make an unauthorized decision, somebody on the ground should at least have the paperwork. Ressa Vel asked to see the maintenance logs for the hauler's radiator panel next, and it was in the retrieval of those logs, a task assigned, in the mildly punitive tradition of review boards everywhere, to Vortessen himself, since he was the ranking officer with the least else to do, that the second and larger problem revealed itself. The composite substitution was there, 14 months old, properly logged, properly approved, entirely legal, and entirely absent from any equation anyone had ever used to calculate that hauler's performance margins. Vortessen, having found one, went looking for others, partly out of diligence and partly, he would admit much later, to almost no one, out of a stubborn refusal to be the only person in the room who had been visibly, spectacularly wrong. He found 11 more, 11 other vessels, across 11 separate incidents spanning the last 40 years, each one closed out with some variation of undetermined mechanical failure, each one involving a manufacturing substitution, a maintenance shortcut, or a thermal variance that fell outside the clean assumptions of the transit equations by a margin that, when Vortessen finally sat down and added the numbers, hovered with uncomfortable consistency around 11%. 3 of those 11 incidents had involved crewed vessels. 2 of the crews had not survived. One of them, the board established over the course of a grim, quiet afternoon, had been a supply run almost identical to Dax's, flown 8 years earlier by a young Ashari navigator named Telebris, whose final transmission, recovered years later, from a recorder nobody had thought worth the cost of retrieving until now, consisted of a calm, professional report that all systems remained within nominal parameters, followed, 40 minutes later, by silence. Telebris had trusted the instruments the way she had been trained to trust them, because the instruments had never once, in her career, given her a reason not to, and the review board sat with that fact for a long moment before Ressa Vel asked, in a voice with considerably less procedural distance than before, whether anyone in the room believed Telebris had done anything wrong. No one did. That was, in its way, the worst part of the finding. Not that a mistake had been made, but that no mistake had been made at all by anyone at any point, according to every standard the coalition had ever used to measure competence. The equations had been followed perfectly. The pilot had trusted them perfectly. The system had worked exactly as designed, and the system had still let her die, because the system had never been designed to imagine the thing that killed her. Vortessen requested, and was granted, a recess before continuing. Vortessen presented this to the board without editorializing, because Helvetic professional culture did not have a graceful mechanism for a person to say, "I built my entire career on a set of equations that I now believe have quietly killed people." And so he simply read the numbers aloud, in the same flat and careful tone he had used to fail a cadet 2 weeks earlier, and let the numbers say it for him. It was, several board members later agreed, the closest thing to an apology any of them had ever heard him give, which was to say it was not an apology at all, but it was something, and among a species that measured sincerity by precision rather than warmth, it counted. "The equations are not wrong," he said, when Ressavel finally asked him directly whether he was recommending they be revised. "They have never once, in 11,000 years, produced an incorrect answer to the question they were designed to answer. The question was wrong. We have spent 11,000 years asking how much fuel a mission requires if the universe behaves exactly as our instruments describe it. We have never asked how much fuel a mission requires if it doesn't." And the human cadet asked the second question. The human cadet's entire species appears to ask the second question by default, Vortessen said. It did not occur to him not to. When I informed him his margin was invented, he did not understand the objection, because to him, a margin that accounts for the possibility of being wrong is not an invention. It is simply what a competent calculation includes. The board's ruling, when it came, was not the triumphant vindication that a simpler story might have offered, and Dax, watching it delivered over a comm channel from the observation deck, where he had spent most of the hearing pretending to review unrelated coursework, appreciated that more than he would have expected to. He was not commended for the unauthorized fuel loading. Ressavel was extremely clear on this point, filing an evaporative loss allowance for a number he had privately calculated using an unapproved method, without disclosing that calculation to his superiors in advance, was a violation of procedure, and it remained a violation of procedure regardless of the outcome, because a review board that rewarded cadets for successful insubordination was a review board that would eventually get someone killed by rewarding the wrong kind of confidence. He received a formal reprimand for it, the mildest available under coalition regulations, and the reprimand went into his permanent record and stayed there, and Dax never once in the years that followed tried to get it removed, because he thought correctly, as it turned out, that the reprimand told a more useful story sitting next to his commendation than it would have told sitting alone. The commendation came next for the override itself, the coolant bypass, the throttled fuel mixture, the decision made under genuine and escalating risk to save coalition cargo, and not incidentally, to prevent a 12th undetermined mechanical failure from quietly joining a list that had just stopped being able to hide. And then came the part that mattered more than either of those, at least to the 11 other human cadets who had spent 3 months being told, politely and precisely and with occasional genuine puzzlement, that their species' instincts about engineering were charmingly primitive. The board ordered a full review of the transit equations, the first substantive revision to coalition-wide flight mathematics in over a millennium, with a mandate to incorporate what the official language drafted, with visible reluctance, by a committee of Helvetic mathematicians who plainly hated every word of it, called a formal margin of uncertainty variable, to be calculated according to methods submitted for consideration by member species. Vortessen was named to the review committee. He had not asked for that either, but Ressavel had a dry sense of humor buried somewhere under all that precision, and she told him privately that a man who had spent 2 weeks discovering he was catastrophically wrong about something he taught for 11 years was exactly the kind of person who ought to be in the room, while everyone else figured out how wrong they'd all been too. The review committee's first working session took place 3 weeks later, in a smaller room than the review board's chamber, with considerably less ceremony and a great deal more arguing. Dax was invited to attend as a consulting cadet, a title invented on the spot because no existing category covered person whose homework started this. He arrived early and found Vortessen already there alone, standing in front of a blank display wall with his hands folded behind his back in the posture Dax recognized, by now, as the Helvetic equivalent of bracing for something unpleasant. "Cadet Okafor," Vortessen said, without turning around. "Sir, I have spent 3 weeks attempting to formalize the concept of margin into a notation elegant enough for the Helvetic mathematical tradition to accept without embarrassment." He turned. His crest, Dax noticed, had settled into a position he hadn't seen before, not raised in challenge, not flattened in the particular way that meant disapproval, but held level, which he would later learn was the Halvenic expression closest to what a human might call being genuinely stumped. I have failed. There is no elegant way to write down how much you do not know. No, sir, Dax agreed. There really isn't. Your second page was not elegant. No, sir. It was, in fact, somewhat ugly. 11 separate correction factors, none of them derived from first principles. Several of them borrowed wholesale from disciplines with no formal relationship to orbital mechanics. Vortessen said this the way another person might describe a bruise, with the faint, lingering surprise of someone still getting used to the shape of an injury. I called it superstition dressed in decimal points. I remember, sir. I would like the record to show that I have reconsidered. Dax, who had spent 3 months learning that Halvenic apologies did not sound like human ones and had to be listened for accordingly, understood this for what it was, and did not make it more complicated than it needed to be. Would it help, he said, if I found you a page 3? Vortessen's crest, for the first time in Dax's experience, did something that the translator did not have a clean word for, and simply rendered, after a half-second's hesitation, as amusement. Coalition mathematics has survived 11,000 years on 2 pages, he said. I suspect it can survive a third. Sit down, cadet. We have a great deal of ugly work ahead of us, and I am told your species is unusually good at it. Dax sat down, pulled up a blank file, and began, for the second time in a month, to show his work, not because anyone was asking him to fail this time, but because for the first time since he'd arrived in coalition space, someone with 11,000 years of certainty behind him was finally willing to turn the page and read what came next. The revised curriculum took the better part of a year to draft and considerably longer than that to be adopted, because 11,000 years of tradition does not surrender a single page without a fight, and the fight, when it came, was fought in exactly the language the Halvenic understood best, committees, subcommittees, and an amount of formal correspondence that would have buried a smaller controversy entirely. Dax was not present for most of it. He had classes to finish, and a training schedule that did not pause to accommodate the slow grinding machinery of institutional change. And besides, he had said what he needed to say twice, once on an exam and once on a flight recorder. And he had learned by then that repeating yourself a third time rarely improved an argument that had already won on its merits. What he was present for 11 months later was the first coalition-wide certification exam to include, officially, permanently, and with a great deal of grudging Halvenic footnoting, a mandatory margin of uncertainty calculation on every transit problem. It was not elegant. Nobody pretended it was elegant. It sat on the page like a scar sits on a hand that has done useful work, a visible reminder that the equation underneath it, however beautiful, had once been wrong about something that mattered, and had been made a little uglier in the repair, and was better for it. Vortessen proctored that exam. It was, by then, generally understood among the cadets, human and otherwise, that this was not a coincidence, and that he had, in the particular way Halvenic officers demonstrated commitment, requested the assignment specifically. He walked the same aisles he had walked 11 months earlier, watching 400 cadets fill in the same clean columns of Halvenic notation, followed now, on every single answer sheet, by a second section that had no equivalent anywhere in 11,000 years of coalition history, an open field unformatted, unranked by elegance, in which a cadet was required to write down everything they did not know for certain, and account for it anyway. He stopped, this time, at a young Ashari cadet 3 rows from front, whose margin calculation was thorough, defensible, and almost aggressively cautious, nearly 14%, well above the 11 that had started the entire controversy. You have accounted for possibilities that verge on the statistically negligible, Vortessen observed, in the same flat tone he had once used to announce a 0. The cadet, who had clearly heard the story of the exam that had rewritten coalition mathematics at least as many times as everyone else on the station, did not flinch. With respect, sir, I'd rather turn out to have been slightly wasteful than turn out to have been the 12th undetermined mechanical failure. Vortessen's crest, for a long moment, did the thing that still did not have a clean word in translation, and he moved on down the row without correcting the number. Dax stayed with the coalition for 11 more years, long enough to watch the margin calculation stop being called the human variable and start simply being called the variable, the way a foreign word eventually stops sounding foreign and just becomes the word you reach for. He was not, in the end, remembered as the man who had beaten Helvenic mathematics at its own game, which was the story the earliest, roughest versions of the incident tended to tell, back when it was still mostly gossip traded in mess halls and academy corridors. He was remembered more accurately and more usefully as the man who had pointed out that mathematics and reality were two different disciplines that happened, most of the time, to agree with each other, and that the 11,000 years in between the times they didn't agree were exactly the years worth planning for. He kept a copy of the original exam, both pages, framed and hung slightly crooked in every quarters he was ever assigned across 4 different star systems, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the only lesson he ever found himself repeating to the human cadets who came after him, year after year, in almost the same words each time. The answer at the bottom of the page is never the whole answer. There is always a second page. The only question that matters, in the end, is whether you are the kind of person who checks